Hi Sugar Geeks, Liz here. Today I'm going to show you a very special tutorial. I'm doing a remake of my first wedding cake ever and showing you guys everything that I wish I would have known when I made my first wedding cake. So when I first started cake decorating, there was no Facebook, there was no social media, there was only books. And there was a lot of stuff that books did not tell me. I didn't understand how to chill my cakes, I didn't understand how to stack them to get those super sharp edges. But did that stop me? No. My first wedding cake was just a hot mess, just sagging corners. It actually vibrated itself to crumbs on the way to delivery. Luckily it was just for a friend, so she forgave me, but it was literally a nightmare. My first tier cracked, so I had to rebake it, and then I tried to stack it warm, so it cracked again. I was using box mix, I was using Wilton fondant. I just didn't know what I was doing. So recently I posted a picture of this cake to my social media and said, hey guys, if you're feeling bad about yourself, this is where I started, to show you that everybody starts from somewhere and it usually isn't very pretty, especially my stuff. And then some people kind of were joking about maybe remaking it, and I thought that's a great idea. So that's what I did. I remade my very first wedding cake, and I'm gonna show you exactly how I did all of those steps. So for this square wedding cake, I'm going to make a 10-inch, 8-inch, and 6-inch layer. So I have two sizes of every cake pan, but if you only have one size, you can totally make that work as well. In total, I had to bake up 3 batches of my white cake recipe to have enough batter for all of my layers. For square layers, I always put parchment paper in the bottom of my pans to help them release easier. You don't have to do this with round pans. And I'm using my homemade pan release because it's cheap, it's easy, and it works really good. I fill the pans about 3/4 of the way full. Since my largest cake is only 10 inches, I'm not even using a baking core because it's not gonna make a difference. But if you're making any cakes that are 12 inches or larger, you might wanna use a baking core to help them bake evenly. I like to weigh each pan once the batter's in there to make sure that each layer has the same amount of batter as the last one so they bake evenly and are all the same height. My large 10-inch cakes took about 45 minutes to cook all the way through at 335 degrees. And then of course the smaller cakes took anywhere from 30 to 35 minutes. Once your cakes are baked, go ahead and let them cool in the pan for about 10 minutes and then you can flip them out to cool fully. I like to put mine in the freezer to get them cooling down faster so I can crumb coat the same day. When I'm baking wedding cakes, I will typically start baking on Wednesday and then I will crumb coat and get everything frosted on Thursday, and that will leave me all Friday to decorate. I always trim the brown off of my white cakes because it makes the slices just look really beautiful. Little secret to those perfect slices. It's not mandatory, but especially for wedding cakes, you might consider doing it, and it only takes a little bit of time. I like my layers to be 2 inches tall, and then I will typically tort them in half lengthwise so that I get more buttercream per cake tier, because who doesn't want more buttercream? For more information on how to trim and tort your cakes, you can watch my tutorial in the link above or on the blog. All right, so I have all of my cakes trimmed and ready to go. I have all of my cake boards cut and my buttercream. So now I'm gonna frost all of my cakes. I don't use simple syrup with my cakes because they're already pretty moist, but you can if you want to. If I'm not doing a filling though, I do about 1/4 inch of buttercream in between each layer of my cake. Sometimes I do 3 layers of cake, sometimes I do 4. Just depends on how much cake I have to bake and how much room I have in my freezer. I'm gonna go ahead and do my first layer of buttercream on my 6-inch cake, and this is called the crumb coat. This seals in all of the crumbs so that you can get a nice clean layer of frosting on the outside, especially if you're not gonna cover it with fondant. Square cakes and round cakes are very different to frost, so while the round cake you would just have to do a crumb coat and a final coat, square cakes, they take a little bit more effort. So that's why I'm using acrylics, so that I can get super sharp edges and corners. But you could use the upside down method, you could use ganache, whatever your client wants. You have that option open. I just definitely do not recommend you use anything like cream cheese frosting or whipped cream, especially if the cake's gonna be outside, and cream cheese frosting under fondant will end up making your fondant melt. So just keep that in mind. I know you guys are probably wondering about how much buttercream I used for this, and this was roughly about 4 batches of my easy buttercream. On square cakes, you have to focus on the corners the most. So a good tip is to start at the edge of the corner and work your way to the center of the cake and then stop. If you pull all the way across the side of the cake, you're going to ruin your sharp corners. For more information on how to cover a square buttercream cake using acrylics, check out my tutorial. I've decided to panel my cakes with fondant because I want the edges to be super sharp. You don't have to use the paneling method. You could do a traditional covering. You can check out my other tutorials on how to cover a square cake in fondant. So paneling does take a little bit longer than the traditional way to cover your cake in fondant, but it does result in super sharp, clean edges. The trick to paneling is to start with a very cold cake and to roll out your fondant in panels. Then we're going to trim them down to the size that's just a little bit bigger than each side. So my top is 8 by 8. I'm going to cut out a square of fondant that's 9 by 9. Then I'm going to put that on a cake board, put it in the freezer for about 10 minutes, and this is actually going to freeze the fondant. So when we put it onto the cake and trim away the edges with a very sharp, brand new X-Acto blade or razor blade, the fondant holds its shape and doesn't sag. The downside of paneling, aside from it taking a little bit longer, is that you end up with seams. Now, I know it seems really obvious to you, but when you decorate the cake, you're not gonna even notice these seams. But I do like to make them as invisible as possible by taking my fondant smoothers and just pushing the seam together and kind of making it as invisible as possible. I really like to use my LMF recipe or wrench-off fondant for pretty much all of my high-end wedding cakes because it tastes really good and is easy to work with. If you're having problems with your fondant and it's cracking or breaking, you just might consider using a different brand, or you can check out my LMF recipe. It's really great for beginners. You would only need 2 batches of fondant, really like a batch and a half. A lot of clients will complain that they don't like fondant, or they don't like the texture of it, and it's just like chocolate. Explain to them that there's different types of fondant. There's gourmet fondant, and then there's cheap fondant. So, gourmet chocolate tastes a lot better than, cheap chocolate. So a good way to convince your client to have fondant on their cake is to put a little piece of fondant during the wedding cake tasting so they can taste what it actually tastes like. I've sold many a wedding cake using this technique. So go ahead and cover the rest of your cakes in fondant and then just put them into the fridge to chill until it's time to stack them. A lot of people think that you can't put your cakes in the refrigerator if they have fondant on them because when you take them out, they start to sweat. This is normal. This is like completely normal. It's not gonna hurt the fondant. It might make it a little bit sticky, especially if you're in a really humid area, but eventually the cake will come to room temperature. And this is a good thing because cakes taste better at room temperature. You don't wanna be eating cold butter inside of your cake. That doesn't taste good. And when it comes to room temperature, it will stop sweating. You can reduce the amount of sweating by doing a couple things. If you live in a humid area, you can put the cake inside of a cardboard box and then put that into the fridge so that when you take it out, the condensation kind of like rests on top of the cardboard and not on top of your cake. The other thing you can do is just have a fan blowing across the surface of your cake, and it just helps the water that's on the surface of your cake evaporate faster. Just don't touch the fondant, don't, mess with it or anything, and it will be okay. Delivering a chilled cake is much, much safer and much easier to stack than an unchilled cake, and it will look cleaner and nicer. Most professionals either work with ganache so that their cakes are nice and stable, or they work with chilled cakes. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stack my first cake onto my cake board. This is a 12-inch cake board from Cake Boards of Air, or you can use a cake drum. Just don't put your cake on like a really thin cardboard or something, because it's just not gonna be sturdy enough to support the weight of all of these cakes. I really like Cake Boards of Air because they're pre-coated in this food-safe material. They have feet so that you can get your fingers under there to lift the cake. Very important, things you don't think of. So I'm gonna stack this cake here, but sometimes I will wait to stack my cakes when I get to the venue, and I'll bring them to just the edge of the table like this. And take my offset spatula to just lift up so I can get my hand under there. And because they've been chilled, they're easy to handle. So I'm just gonna put a little bit of buttercream or ganache just to kind of hold it in place. Try and get it centered as well as possible. When you lower it, you want to use an offset just under the edge. Get your fingers out of the way, and then you can lower it down carefully and then slide your spatula out. So then, if you have a gap around the edges, you just want to take your buttercream and just fill that gap in. Always have extra buttercream or ganache or fondant or whatever you used on your cake when you deliver, just to touch up any mistakes. And you just take your finger and just smooth that out so you get that flawless edge. And if you ever need to caulk a sink, that's exactly how you do it. So I have my 3 cakes that have just come out of the fridge. They have already been chilled, covered, they're ready to go. You might be wondering, but Liz, why do we have cake pans sitting here? We're gonna use these as templates so that we know how big the next cake is. So that's literally what all these are for. I'm stacking my cakes with straws. These are not just regular drinking straws. There's something called milkshake straws. They're a little bit wider and a little bit stronger than your typical drinking straw. Some people use boba tea straws, or you can use wooden dowels. Like, there's so many different options for stacking, but these are the least expensive. They're super easy to put in and to take out, and they're very strong. I've used straws to stack cakes up to 5 tiers. I have my straw guide for knowing how many straws to put into each layer. You can get that on the blog post and download it. So this is an 8-inch cake and it's going on top of a 10-inch cake, right? So I need 8 straws to support this cake. So 1 straw per inch. Do not use 3 straws to support a 10-inch cake. That's how problems happen. So how many straws do you need for a 6-inch cake? That's right, 6. All right, first thing I'm gonna do is take my 8-inch cake pan, and if you're bad at centering, use a ruler. There should be 1 inch of space on every side. I'm just gonna score a line, a guide, if you will. So now we know where our cake is supposed to be at and make sure that we're centered. First thing I do is I poke a hole into the middle of the cake. Go ahead and mark where the top of the cake is with your thumbnail, or you could use a pen if you feel more comfortable. I kind of go, just a little bit tiny down into the fondant. Hold on tight, because there's a vacuum. And that's how tall all of my straws need to be. I know I said we only need 8, but I'd rather be careful. So I have all of the straws around the outside edges, but I don't have anything in the middle. And I don't want to put it right in this hole because that's our vent. So I'm just going to put it right next to it. What I should have done was actually taken these and put them slightly in a little bit further, but I was trying to teach, I'm not thinking. Now we're going to go do the next tier. And because my cakes are chilled, I can actually move them around just a little bit if I have to. Then I'm just going to seal the gap that's around the bottom. Another thing I didn't know with my first wedding cake is how to hide that gap. So all of my cakes had like ribbons around the bottoms, like. If you're curious about the tools and stuff that I take when I deliver a wedding cake, you can check out that tutorial on my website. It's all about the supplies that I bring. I call it my oh shoot kit. It's an emergency kit. All of the tools, my recommendations for things to bring with you to fix any sort of emergencies and put final touches on a wedding cake when you're delivering. Oh, that's heavy. Okay, time to decorate. So I'm redoing the design that I had on my original cake that had some scroll work on the center tier. So I used, I think, buttercream the first time, and I'm gonna use buttercream this time as well, just because I feel it's easier than using royal icing. And at the time, all I knew how to do was like S's. So you'd just be like, this kind of thing. Oops, that's called a pop. That's not super cute. It's very kind of old-fashioned looking. So I'm going to show you the kind of scrolls that I do now. So what I do is I try to create flow coming from whatever the focal point is. So we're going to have flowers coming all the way down the front. So I'm going to create scroll work that's flowing off of that and kind of accenting it to create movement. So I'm going to take my piping bag and I'm going to create like a swirl, like wind, like imagine wind, right? And this is a number 4 piping tip. I kind of feel like I should have like a slightly bigger one, but I don't have one, so. And then I'm going to take another swirl, but go in the opposite direction. And if you need to practice a few times on parchment paper, which I probably should have, you can. And then I'm going to come in with a few little lines going like this. And we're basically going to recreate that same swirl over and over again. I think one of the hardest things about learning how to pipe swirls is understanding how hard to press. So if you're pushing and it's coming out really squiggly, you're just pressing too hard. So, and if it's breaking, then you might be pressing hard enough, but you're moving too quickly. So it might take you a couple minutes to figure out a good flow. Basically anywhere there's kind of like a hole, you can put little dots, 3 little dots, and that kind of fills up any empty space. All right, so now we get to add some flowers to our cake. We have our buttercream flowers that have been frozen solid, so we can easily take them off the paper. My hands are warm though, so you're gonna have to work quickly, and if they start getting too soft, you might have to put them back in the freezer. I didn't want to make this video too long for you guys, so if you're interested in how to make these easy buttercream flowers, go ahead and check out my tutorial on sugargeekshow.com. I just have a little bit of my white buttercream that I'm just gonna start adding some flowers in. I thought about doing these in fondant again, but because this is like an updated version, I wanted to use something which is a little bit trendier. And right now, buttercream flowers are like so hot, but not too hot because it's like buttercream. Sorry, I'm getting cheesy. I'm just starting with my dark purple ones first. When I first did this design with the fondant, I had like never used a fondant flower cutter before, and I was absolutely amazed that there was like this thing that existed that could just cut flower shapes into fondant. So they were like super chunky and they were like not smoothed down or refined at all. They were just these super chunky, not very delicate looking flowers. I have a leaf tip. It's a leaf tip that has the little V cut out of the center, and you just have to have the little V is to the side so you don't see the hole from the top. And when you pipe, you squeeze and pull. And it just makes these cute little leaves with a vein in the middle. And you can add them to some of your scrolls, just like texture. So I'm gonna take some of my purple buttercream and just add some more purple to it. And I'm gonna make kind of a really dark purple to use for the centers of my flowers. And very quickly apply my next color while they're still cold. I'm kind of trying to cluster them though, you know, around the center, down this line, and then they kind of spread out. And I've only been using 3 colors, you know, well actually 1 color really. I started with my dark purple and then lightened it and lightened it some more. So that way you can get variations in color and depth and it looks elegant, but it all goes together. It all matches. It all has the same undertone. And lastly, we have our white buttercream flowers. And you know, you won't be able to really see the white, like it's white on white texture, but it just adds more depth to the overall design. So I'm gonna put these kind of around the outside edges. So now I am going to just come in with some more little dots to fill the centers where I feel like it needs. It just feels like empty, and maybe a few more like piped leaves. And I think I'm actually gonna, even though my original design only had swirls here, I think it makes sense to kind of have a few coming off some of these like flowers down here. There it is. That is our finished wedding cake redo of my very first wedding cake. It's a little bit better. That's it, guys. That is how I remade my very first wedding cake. Hopefully this has motivated you and given you some confidence if you feel like you're struggling and you're never gonna get better. Trust me, you will get better. Don't give up. I'll see you guys next time.